Hi! The hot topic that we're going to go over today is the achievement gap, and this video and PowerPoint were produced by Adencia Avila and Laura Banks. So to start off, I wanted to go over the guiding questions that we used when reading through our articles as well as creating this presentation. So the first off is, what is the achievement gap? Then we're going to talk about between what groups the achievement gap is most prevalent, what some possible causes are of the achievement gap, what is being done to close the achievement gap, and this we're talking about more policies that are being put in place. Then we're going to do some possible solutions for the achievement gap, as well as the role that teachers play in closing that gap. So I want to take a second before we get started, and I want you to stop this video and just answer the two following questions. The first one, what do you think when you hear achievement gap? And then what do you already know about the achievement gap? It's something that I know we talk about a lot in our education courses, so I just want to know what you already know about it. So take a second and just think about that, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. So what is the achievement gap? And there's a ton of different definitions. So I picked the two that had different aspects that I really liked of them, and I'll talk about what I liked. So the first one is just that it's the persistent disparity between performance of African American and Hispanic students and that of white and Asian American students. And the second one was the term typically used to refer to differences in pupil attainment associated with social class, ethnicity, and gender. So for the first one, as you can see, I bolded the word persistent. I really wanted to point out that this is something that hasn't just happened overnight. It's something that has been reoccurring for generations, and it has no signs of slowing down, and it's never in the past disappeared. It's been there from the beginning. The second one I wanted to point out was it's not necessarily just between ethnic groups, which is generally what we do associate with, but it could also be socioeconomic status as well as gender. The basics, it's just a difference between two groups of people and their achievements. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a defined ethnicity, social economic status, or gender, but these are generally what we're going to look at in education. So the achievement gap is actually one of the biggest social problems that's facing American society today, and a lot of the articles that we're reading have actually gone to the point where they're considering it a national crisis. And when we go on to the next slide, maybe you'll see a little bit why. So these are two figures, and they are from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is basically a progress report done by the National Education Society. And what they show is they basically show that there's a gap between, in the left corner, we've got a gap between white and black students reaching all the way back to 1971, all the way up to 2012. And then on the bottom, you have Hispanic versus white, showing that same gap, generally around the same numbers, starting in 75 and going all the way to 2012. So again, this is something that is persistent. It has been going on, and although lots of policies and things have been put into place, it's still not showing much closure. So we wanted to look at what groups the achievement gap is really seen between. And the ones that are most talked about in education are, first off, socioeconomic status. Second would be ethnicity. And then we tend to talk about suburban versus urban schools. So in general, we talk about this achievement gap that persists between students of color and white counterparts. And a lot of time we look at socioeconomic status for that, saying that it has to do with poorer communities or how much the family makes income-wise. However, that's not necessarily always the case, although that is one of the indicators. You can also look at middle class students, no matter their ethnicity, and you're still going to see that gap between African American and Hispanic students compared to white and Asian American students. So ethnicity is also playing a role here. And then talking about suburban versus urban schools, one of our articles, actually by Sandy and Duncan, they talked about how the fact that majority of these differences can actually be explained simply by family background and race. So urban schools tend to be lower than suburban schools, but they tend to have higher concentrations of minority and low-income students. So they were saying that a majority of the reasons for that achievement gap fall back on the previous two of socioeconomic status and ethnicity. So, that being said, what are some possible causes? So we're going to look at things that might actually be affecting this achievement gap. So the first thing you're looking at is social factors. You're looking at economic factors, unqualified teachers, low expectations for students, and then what we call disidentification. So the conventional way of looking at things, the achievement gap has always been a school problem. However, after reading through these articles, this idea of it being a school problem solely is kind of narrow-minded. The achievement gap and schooling itself in the broader context. Oh my goodness. Okay, let me just restart that sentence. When we set the achievement gap in schooling itself in the broader context of how children grow up, it becomes clear that the issue is far larger than what we see in the classroom. Its roots are far beyond the reaches of schools. So we need to get past this idea of just school-based strategies and programs are going to fix this problem. So although it does go past school, educators still need to do everything that they can to reduce the gap. So again, two things are pretty clear. First of all, it's not students or schools that are causing this gap. So skin color, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, none of these by themselves are going to determine a student's performance. However, they do reflect back on schools that they attend and what that looks like in the classroom. For example, high minority, low performing schools hire fewer top teachers. So that tends to affect how students are learning in the classroom. And again, this isn't because the schools want to hire less qualified teachers, but simply they can't attract and keep those teachers who tend to move on to districts with either more money or more compensation, more refund, or more funding. Sorry. So we talked about this idea that teachers can expect too little of their students. So teachers tend to expect too little of African American, Hispanic students, and they also offer them less outreach and support than they do to the white and Asian American counterparts. Also, reading through these, we looked at some data that confirmed that school influence was actually not the biggest factor, as I mentioned, but it's actually what happens at home and what happens outside of school or on television, what they see, that the students are going to focus the most on. So this idea of what they see on TV or what they're seeing outside of school is actually going to influence them in a different way. Students tend, so African American students particular is what this study looked at, and they actually try to protect against the humiliation of being seen as less capable by not investing themselves and their energy in school. And we call this disidentification. So this idea of, well, I don't want to be seen as less capable, so therefore I'm just not going to put any energy in. So this is where teachers can step in. Teachers can help to not perpetuate these stereotypes and help to alleviate this disidentification. However, in general, it's been seen that they actually perpetuate them. And most of the time not intentionally, but it does happen. And this is actually contributing to that gap. So what is being done in order to close the achievement gap? So closing the gap is extremely important. And we see that for our entire nature, for our economy, for social stability, and just for our moral health as a nation. So we have a few things in place. So the first thing would be the No Child Left Behind Act, which was meant to hold teachers accountable for minimizing the gap. However, outcomes have shown that it might not be quite as reflective of we thought it was going to be, because the standardized testing puts a lot of pressures on teachers as well as on students to do well. But there are more things in place, such as California, we learned about a few weeks ago, the new funding where we're getting more money into lower income schools for their lower income students. And then we've also got new standards like Common Core and NGSS that are allowing teachers more flexibility as well as rigor. And so we can actually better incorporate what's interesting to our students and culturally relevant to our students. So although we have all of these things in place and we're trying to make schools welcoming, comforting, and safe environments for all students, it's, again, very narrow-minded to think that the achievement gap is going to be closed simply by schools themselves. It's actually more of a national crisis, as mentioned before, than anything. So the achievement gap has actually been shown to happen before kids reach kindergarten. So children coming into kindergarten have actually shown this gap, and it's just compounded outside of school. And here's some examples. So for instance, lower income students, when they come into kindergarten, tend to come in with vocabularies of about 5,000 words opposed to 20,000 words that students of middle class families come in with. Another thing that has been shown is that during the summer, when students aren't in school, when they come back in September, lower income students have actually shown regression over the summer, whereas middle and upper class students show progress, that they've continued learning throughout the summer. So even if a teacher does everything correctly at the end of the year, that gap is still persisting. And that comes down to, the studies have shown, television watching and parent involvement have been two of the major factors in that. But as teachers, we can only do the part for us in the classroom. And so it's our job to make sure that those students aren't falling behind while they're in our class, so that even with these outside aspects that are out of our control, we're still helping them to try to keep up and minimizing that gap as much as we possibly can. So what exactly can we do? And that's my next point. So what role do teachers play in the achievement gap? And I think it really comes down to the need for qualified teachers, even in the low-income schools, where they need it really more than anywhere else. Another thing, we need support for all students. So making sure that your classroom is that safe and accepting area for all students. And then the next thing is creating opportunities. And this can look different in any classroom, in any community, but just maybe outside programs, tutoring, anything that your students need, just opportunities, whether it's getting internship opportunities or job opportunities, just making sure that your students have every opportunity available to them. And the last one, which we hear about all the time, differentiated instruction, just making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we hit all of the different students, whether it's based on their learning styles, based on their culture, but just making sure that we have, in every lesson that we do, reached every student in our classroom. So as my closing remarks, teachers must emphasize options, which can include multiple texts, supplementary materials, group projects, assignments, making sure that those assignments hit all the different levels of complexity, as well as assessments that measure student performance with respect to a range of abilities. So just remembering that your students all come from different areas, that they might be coming with different background, and that gap may already exist, and it's your job to help facilitate them at wherever they're at, meet them where they're at, and go from there. So yeah, that is our presentation. So what I would like you to do is, I have posted the Padlet response URL underneath this presentation. But what I would like you to do is go, and I just want you to respond to 2 things. Gives us a little bit of feedback on what you guys thought. So the first thing is, I just want you to list one thing you learned that was new about the achievement gap. I know a lot of us do have some ideas going into it. And then the second thing is, what can you do as a teacher in your classroom to help lessen the achievement gap? So this is specifically for you, something maybe you weren't already doing, but what, now that you've learned everything here, what could you do to make a difference? And then last but not least are our sources. So thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful night.